Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer where we're unpacking FDA packaging regulations. Let's be real, government compliance rules can be incredibly dense and tough to navigate. But today, we're going to take those complex mandates and translate them into clear, actionable insights for your product and supply chain strategies. Because if you work anywhere near the food or packaging industry, understanding these rules isn't just a helpful tip, it's an absolute legal requirement.
So I want to kick things off with a question that honestly surprises a lot of everyday consumers, but is a daily reality for industry professionals. Does the FDA regulate your plastic food containers as strictly as the food inside them? The short answer? Absolutely yes. The surprising reality is that the packaging actually holding our food, the plastics, the films, the resins, gets scrutinized just as heavily as the edible ingredients themselves.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. Decoding food packaging rules. 2. What the regulation requires. 3. Why this safety matters. 4. How to measure compliance. And finally, 5. The cost of non-compliance. Let's jump right in.
Part 1. Decoding food packaging rules.
When you're digging into the FDA's massive rulebook, there's this one foundational concept you absolutely have to get: the indirect food additive. Think about it like a tea bag. When you drop a tea bag into hot water, the heat causes invisible elements of that packaging to seep out into the drink. Obviously, the packaging itself isn't meant to be eaten, but because it physically touches the food, parts of it inevitably transfer over. Well, the FDA treats those transferring chemicals as additives, basically looking at them exactly the same way as if you had poured them directly into the recipe yourself.
And this really shows you just how massive the scope of these regulations is. We're not just talking about standard water bottles here. The rules cover everyday packaging polymers like acrylics, cellophanes, nylons, polycarbonates, polyurethanes, and even rubber articles used in factories. It applies to everything, from the rigid plastic jug holding your milk to the flexible film wrapped around a block of cheese, all the way down to the rubber conveyor belts running through the processing plant.
Moving on to Part 2, what the regulation requires.
So if you're a manufacturer trying to bring a new food contact product to the market, what do you actually have to do? Well, first off, you can't just invent a cool new plastic in a lab, mold it into a bowl, and start selling it. No way. The FDA provides a highly specific, very strict roster of permitted chemicals, base polymers, and additives. If your chemical formulation isn't on that approved list, or even if you use an approved chemical but at a higher concentration than they allow, your packaging is instantly considered non-compliant.
The rules here are incredibly strict. You have to meet those exact chemical formulations we just talked about. You also have to adhere to strict extraction limits, which basically means proving your plastic doesn't leak chemicals beyond a safe threshold. On top of that, you must follow broader good manufacturing practices. And here's a detail that's actually pretty fascinating. If you're making repeated use items, like factory rubber parts or reusable containers, the law literally mandates that they must be thoroughly washed and cleansed before their very first use with food.
Now for Part 3, why this safety matters.
You might be wondering, why does the FDA go to such incredible lengths here? Well, the entire underlying philosophy comes down to consumer health. You see, when a package is just sitting on a store shelf, it's not actually passive. Heat, highly acidic foods, and heavy fats can act almost like magnets or solvents, pulling chemicals out of the plastic and right into your meal. The FDA's strict limits on chemical leaching exist entirely to make sure that these invisible migrations don't dangerously contaminate our food supply. To give you an idea of just how strict this is, check out this number, 0.5 milligrams per square inch. Across a bunch of different plastics and resins covered in the regulation, this is a super common legal limit for chemical extraction. To put that into perspective, we are talking about a microscopic allowable margin for chemical leaching. If your plastic container leaks even a tiny fraction of a milligram more than this per square inch during lab testing, it's deemed unsafe.
Which brings us to Part 4, how to measure compliance.
So how does a company practically prove to the government that their packaging meets that tiny 0.5 milligram limit? It takes rigorous laboratory testing, which generally happens in 3 steps. First, you identify the exact polymer formulation of your product. Second, you put the plastic in a lab and simulate its real-world food contact conditions. And third, you measure the chemical extraction to see if it actually passes the threshold. Step 2 is where things get really interesting. Labs don't just dump actual food into the containers. Instead, they use specific chemical solvents designed to mimic different types of food. For instance, if your packaging is meant to hold acidic foods like orange juice or tomato sauce, the lab will test it using a 3% acetic acid solution. If it's going to hold fatty or oily foods, they use a much harsher solvent called N-heptane, simply because fats are notoriously good at pulling chemicals out of plastics.
But if your packaging only ever touches dry solids like dry pasta, the rules are way more relaxed. And honestly, a lot of times, no extraction test is required at all.
But wait, it's not just about the type of food, it's also about the temperature. The intended temperature that your product is going to experience in the real world totally dictates how tough that testing simulation is going to be. Heat accelerates chemical leaching. So a plastic container designed for microwaving or hot filling faces far more rigorous high-temperature lab testing than a plastic bag that's only ever going to sit in a freezer.
Finally, Part 5, the cost of non-compliance.
Why should professionals take these complex regulations so incredibly seriously? Basically, as a business, you've got two paths in front of you. The compliant path is great. It gives you smooth market access, builds strong consumer trust, and guarantees product safety. But the non-compliant path, whether it happens because of a simple mistake or intentional cost-cutting, leads to devastating business consequences, aggressive FDA action, and a legal classification of selling adulterated food. Because remember, if the packaging is illegal, the food inside it is legally considered adulterated too.
If your packaging fails those extraction tests, or if you've unapproved additives are used, the risks are huge. We're talking about public FDA warning letters, having your market entry completely blocked, dealing with mandatory and highly expensive product recalls, severe long-term damage to your brand, and massive legal liability. Getting your plastics wrong isn't just some minor administrative oopsie, it is a critical threat to the very survival of your product line.
Which brings us to a really important final question for you and your team to think about. Is your supply chain actively testing its packaging materials against their specific real-world end-use conditions? You really can't just assume a plastic is safe. You have to verify the polymers, simulate the heat, test the solvents, and protect your consumers. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time as we continue to break down the vital frameworks shaping our industries.
If you found this helpful or want to stay updated when this regulation changes, subscribe and support the channel. And if you need the full technical details on this CFR, click the link in the description below. See you next time.